One evening, in the heart of a bustling city, a black journalist was on his way home when a police officer stopped him, accusing him of fraud. What unfolded next revealed a shocking truth, forcing not just the officer, but an entire community to confront their deep-seated biases. Before we dive into this powerful story, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss more inspiring and thought-provoking videos like this one. Your support helps us share impactful stories that matter. Now, let's get started. The sun had just begun to set over the bustling city, casting a golden hue on the towering skyscrapers of downtown. The streets of New York, or London, were alive with the usual evening rush as people hurried to wrap up their day. Cars honked impatiently, food vendors called out to passers-by, and the murmur of conversations filled the air. It was a typical urban scene, a blend of organized chaos and routine. Amidst the crowd, David, a well-dressed black man in his early 30s, stepped out of a sleek office building. He carried a leather briefcase tightly in one hand, clutching it as if it contained something valuable. His face showed a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction, another long day at work, but progress made. David was an investigative journalist, known for his sharp mind and relentless pursuit of truth. Today, he was coming back from a significant meeting, holding documents that could crack open a major corruption case. On the opposite side of the street, Officer Carter patrolled with his usual stern demeanor. A seasoned white police officer in his 40s, Carter was known in the precinct for his strict adherence to rules and his no-nonsense attitude. He prided himself on his sharp instincts and his ability to detect trouble before it escalated. As he walked along the sidewalk, his eyes constantly scanned the surroundings, looking for anything out of the ordinary. Carter's gaze landed on David, just as he was approaching a parked luxury car. Something about the scene caught Carter's attention. A black man, well-dressed, with important-looking documents, heading towards an expensive vehicle. His mind immediately jumped to suspicion. Years of experience and perhaps some unconscious biases played into his thinking. He adjusted his belt, squared his shoulders, and started crossing the street towards David. David, unaware of the officer's intentions, paused briefly to unlock his car. He was used to being watched, but today he felt a little more urgency, a little more pressure. The documents he carried were crucial, and he needed to get home and prepare for the next stage of his investigation. Just as David opened the car door, Carter approached. "Excuse me, sir," Carter said, his tone sharp and authoritative. David turned, slightly surprised but composed. "Is this your car?" Carter asked, his eyes narrowing. David's heart sank slightly. He knew where this was going. Officer Carter's gaze hardened as he watched David step into the luxury car. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him. In his mind, the image of David, a young black man in a sharp suit, holding what appeared to be important documents, didn't align with the sleek, expensive vehicle he was about to drive. His instincts, sharpened by years on the force, whispered that something was amiss. Without hesitation, Carter strode towards David, his hand resting on his belt, ready to assert his authority. "Excuse me, sir," he called out, his voice firm but controlled. David looked up, startled but composed. "Yes, officer? Is there a problem?" Carter glanced at the car, then at the briefcase in David's hand. "Is this your vehicle?" he asked, his tone making it clear he was already doubtful of the answer. David furrowed his brow. "Yes, it is. Is something wrong?" Carter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he scanned David's face, looking for any sign of deceit. "May I see some identification and proof of ownership?" he finally demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. David hesitated for a moment, confused by the sudden interrogation. "Sure," he said, reaching into his pocket to retrieve his wallet. He handed over his driver's license and car registration. "Everything's in order." Carter scrutinized the documents, but the seed of suspicion had already been planted in his mind. The fact that everything appeared legitimate only seemed to make him more skeptical. "What's in the briefcase?" he asked, nodding towards the leather bag still clutched tightly in David's hand. "Just work papers," David replied calmly, though his patience was beginning to wear thin. "I'm an investigative journalist." Carter's eyes narrowed. "Work papers, huh? Mind if I take a look?" David stiffened. "Actually, I do mind. These are confidential documents." The officer's posture shifted, becoming more confrontational. "Look, you're acting awfully suspicious. You're driving a car that doesn't seem like it belongs to you, and now you're refusing a simple request. Are you sure you're not hiding something?" David's temper flared, but he kept his voice steady. "I've shown you my ID and my car registration. I've answered your questions. Now, unless you have a valid reason to detain me, I'd like to go." Carter stepped closer, his hand now resting on his radio. "You're not going anywhere just yet. I need to verify everything. For all I know, those documents could be forged." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. His mind raced, grappling with the familiar sting of being profiled. "This is ridiculous," he said, frustration creeping into his voice. "I've done nothing wrong." By now, the exchange had drawn the attention of passers-by. A small crowd began to gather, their curious and concerned faces reflecting the tension in the air. Whispers spread as people speculated about what was happening. "Hey, what's going on here?" someone in the crowd called out. David took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. "This officer thinks I'm committing fraud because I'm driving a nice car and carrying documents." The murmurs grew louder. Some people pulled out their phones, recording the unfolding scene. Carter, aware of the crowd but undeterred, gestured for backup on his radio. David felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The humiliation of being treated like a criminal in front of strangers was almost unbearable, but he knew he had to stand his ground. "Officer, I've cooperated fully. You have no reason to keep me here." Carter's face remained stoic. "We'll see about that," he said coldly. Minutes later, another patrol car pulled up, and 2 more officers joined the scene. Carter briefed them, handing over David's documents for further inspection. The crowd continued to watch, some visibly uncomfortable, others angry at the blatant display of racial profiling. One man in the crowd spoke up, his voice loud and clear. "This is wrong. You can't just assume he's guilty because of how he looks." Carter shot the man a warning glance, but didn't respond. The tension was palpable, the situation teetering on the edge of escalation. David, feeling the support from the crowd, found his voice again. "I have nothing to hide. I'm a journalist working on an important case. Your assumptions are based on nothing but bias." Carter's jaw tightened. For a moment, doubt flickered in his eyes, but his pride wouldn't let him back down just yet. "We'll wait for confirmation," he said curtly. As the seconds dragged into minutes, David stood tall, refusing to be intimidated. He knew the truth would come out, but the damage had already been done. The crowd, the cameras, the humiliation, none of it could be undone. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder as Officer Carter signaled for David to be taken to the police station. Despite the protests and the rising tension, Carter remained firm in his decision. "You're coming with us," he said, gripping David's arm more tightly than necessary. David's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of frustration and helplessness washing over him. "This is a mistake," he said firmly, trying to reason with Carter. "I've done nothing wrong." Ignoring his pleas, Carter led David to the patrol car, his grip unrelenting. The crowd watched in disbelief, some shaking their heads, others recording the incident on their phones. The humiliation David felt was overwhelming, but he knew he couldn't lose his composure. He had to stay strong, no matter how unjust the situation felt. At the station, David was ushered into a sterile interrogation room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the cold metal table. Carter stood on the other side, his expression stern, as two other officers entered the room with a file containing the documents David had been carrying. David sat with his hands folded on the table, his mind racing. He had spent years building his career, uncovering truths that others wanted to keep hidden. Now, he was being treated like a criminal because of someone else's biases. The sting of injustice was sharp, but he refused to let his anger take control. "Let's get this straight," Carter began, his voice sharp. "You claim to be an investigative journalist, but you're carrying documents that look suspicious. You're driving a car that seems out of your league. It doesn't add up." David took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "I've already explained. I'm an investigative journalist. The documents are related to a case I'm working on. It's all legitimate." Carter smirked, unconvinced. "We'll see about that. We've got people verifying these documents right now. If there's anything off, you'll be facing charges." The minutes ticked by slowly, each second stretching into an eternity. David sat silently, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. He thought about the stories he had written, the corrupt officials he had exposed, and the truth he had fought for. This was just another obstacle, another injustice he had to endure. Finally, an officer entered the room holding a thick file. He handed it to Carter, his expression neutral. "We've got the results," the officer said, stepping back. Carter opened the file, skimming through the pages. His confident demeanor began to waver as he read. The documents were verified, every single one authentic. The notes and evidence pointed to a major corruption case involving powerful figures. David's investigation was not only legitimate, but it was also crucial. Carter's face hardened, but there was no denying the truth anymore. "Well, it seems everything checks out," he admitted reluctantly. "You are who you say you are." David's eyes narrowed, his patience finally wearing thin. "I told you from the beginning," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm a journalist, and I'm doing my job. You assumed the worst because of how I look. That's on you." Carter shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his actions beginning to sink in. He had let his biases cloud his judgment, and now the consequences were unfolding before him. "You're free to go," Carter said, his voice lacking the authority it once held. "I apologize for the inconvenience." David stood, gathering his belongings with measured movements. He looked Carter in the eye, his expression a mix of exhaustion and disappointment. "Inconvenience?" he repeated. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was an abuse of power, an example of the systemic racism that people like me face every day. Carter opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss for words. David continued, his voice filled with conviction. "I hope you learned something from this. I hope you realize that your actions have consequences, not just for me, but for everyone who saw what happened today." With that, David turned and walked out of the room, his head held high. He knew the battle wasn't over, but he had won this round. The experience had been humiliating and infuriating, but it had also reinforced his resolve to fight against the very injustices he had just faced. As he stepped out into the night air, David felt a sense of clarity. The documents in his briefcase were more than just papers. They were a symbol of his commitment to uncovering the truth and holding those in power accountable. And now, more than ever, he was determined to see his investigation through to the end. Back in the station, Carter sat alone, the weight of his actions pressing heavily on his shoulders. He knew he had made a grave mistake, one that couldn't be undone with a simple apology. The incident would stay with him, a constant reminder of the biases he needed to confront within himself. The night was far from over, but for David, it marked the beginning of a new chapter. He had faced discrimination head-on and emerged stronger. Now it was time to channel that strength into his work, to shine a light on the darkness that still lingered in the world. As he walked away from the station, David knew that his story was just one of many. But he also knew that by sharing it, He could inspire others to stand up against injustice, to challenge their own biases, and to work towards a future where everyone was treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. Officer Carter sat alone in the dimly lit room, the weight of his actions pressing heavily on his chest. The silence was deafening, and the cold, stark atmosphere of the station only amplified his inner turmoil. The confrontation with David had shaken him more than he cared to admit. For years, Carter had prided himself on being a good officer, someone who upheld the law without prejudice. Yet tonight, he was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. He had let his unconscious biases dictate his actions. He replayed the events in his mind. The way he had approached David, the immediate suspicion, the refusal to listen, and the public humiliation. Each moment was like a painful jab, a reminder of his failure to uphold the very principles he had sworn to protect. Carter leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. He couldn't escape the gnawing realization that he had wronged an innocent man, a man who had done nothing but go about his day, only to be stopped and accused because of the color of his skin. David's words echoed in his mind, cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. "You assumed the worst because of how I look. That's on you." The disappointment in David's eyes, the strength with which he had carried himself despite the blatant injustice, was a stark contrast to Carter's own behavior. The door to the room creaked open, and David stepped back in, his posture still composed, though his eyes held a storm of emotions: anger, frustration, and a deep simmering sadness. Carter looked up, his gaze meeting David's. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension thick in the air. "I needed to say something," David began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This isn't just about me. What happened tonight happens to Black individuals every single day. People are judged, harassed, and humiliated simply because of their skin color. It's exhausting, dehumanizing, and frankly, unacceptable." Carter swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to respond, but he knew that anything he said would sound hollow. Instead, he listened, really listened, as David continued. "I've spent my career uncovering the truth, shining a light on corruption, on injustice. But tonight, I was the one who had to endure it. And it's not just about being stopped or questioned. It's about the message it sends, that we're not trusted, that we're always under suspicion. It's about the fear that this won't be the last time, that it might happen again tomorrow, or the day after." David paused, taking a deep breath. "You have the power, Officer Carter, the power to change the narrative, to challenge your own biases, and to treat people with the respect they deserve. What you did tonight, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a violation of my dignity." Carter felt a lump in his throat, his chest tightening with regret. I don't know what to say," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was doing my job, but I see now that I let my own biases cloud my judgment." "I'm sorry, David. Truly, I am." David's expression softened slightly, though the hurt was still evident. "Apologies are a start, but they're not enough. What matters is what you do next. How you treat the next person who doesn't look like you. How you confront the biases you might not even realize you have." Carter nodded slowly, his mind racing with thoughts and emotions. "I want to change," he admitted, the sincerity in his voice evident. "I don't want to be the kind of officer who judges people based on their appearance. I see now how wrong I was, and I want to do better." David looked at him for a long moment, assessing his words. "It's not just about wanting to change, Officer Carter. It's about taking action. Educate yourself. Listen to the stories of those who faced this kind of discrimination. Use your position to make a difference." Carter's eyes welled with unshed tears, the gravity of David's words sinking deep into his soul. "I will," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want this to happen again. Not to anyone." David gave a small nod, his expression still somber. "Good. Because the world doesn't need more apologies. It needs people who are willing to stand up, speak out, and make real changes." The room fell silent once more, the weight of the conversation hanging heavily in the air. Carter felt a newfound resolve take root within him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to face it head-on, to confront his own biases, and to be an ally in the fight against racism. David turned to leave, but before he stepped out, he looked back at Carter one last time. "Remember this moment," he said. "Remember how it felt to be wrong, and let that fuel your desire to do better." Carter nodded, the words etching themselves into his heart. "I will, David. Thank you for making me see." As David walked out of the station, Carter sat in the quiet room, reflecting on the profound lesson he had learned. The encounter had shaken him to his core, but it had also opened his eyes to the reality of systemic racism and the importance of acknowledging and addressing it. From that night forward, Carter made a commitment to himself, to be more than just a law enforcer but a protector of justice, fairness, and equality. And while the journey towards change was just beginning, he knew that with each step, he could make a difference, one person at a time. Officer Carter stood outside the station, the cool night air brushing against his face as he waited. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, reflecting on the events of the evening and the profound impact David's words had left on him. The guilt of his actions weighed heavily on his conscience, but within that guilt was a spark of determination to make things right. Moments later, David stepped out, his demeanor calm but guarded. The streetlights cast a soft glow on the pavement, and for a brief moment, the bustling city around them seemed to quiet. Carter approached, his steps measured and purposeful. "David," Carter began, his voice steady but filled with genuine remorse, "I owe you an apology, a real one. What I did tonight was wrong, and I can't begin to express how sorry I am. I let my own biases dictate my actions, and that's inexcusable." David looked at him, his expression unreadable. "It's not just about an apology, Officer Carter," he said. "It's about what you do from here." Carter nodded, acknowledging the truth in David's words. "I understand that now. I've got a lot to learn, and I promise you, I'm committed to doing better. Not just for myself, but for every person I encounter in the line of duty. I want to be part of the solution, not the problem." David studied him for a moment, his gaze softening slightly. "Actions speak louder than words, Carter. If you're serious about change, then prove it through your actions." "I will," Carter replied earnestly. "I know I can't undo what happened, but I want to use this experience to grow, to be more mindful, and to challenge the biases that I didn't even realize I had." David gave a small nod, acknowledging Carter's sincerity. "Good, because this isn't just about you and me. It's about a system that needs to change, and that starts with individuals like you taking responsibility." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation lingering in the air. Then Carter extended his hand. "Thank you for making me see," he said. "I won't forget this." David shook his hand, the gesture marking a tentative step toward understanding. "Make sure you don't," he said simply. Back at his apartment, David sat at his desk, the city lights twinkling outside his window. He opened his laptop and began typing, the words flowing effortlessly as he recounted the events of the day. This wasn't just another story, it was a personal narrative, a testament to the pervasive effects of racism and the importance of confronting it head-on. David detailed the encounter, highlighting the systemic issues that led to moments like these. He wove in stories of others who had faced similar injustices, painting a broader picture of the challenges Black individuals face daily. His goal was clear: to shed light on these issues and inspire meaningful dialogue and change. As he typed the final words, David felt a sense of fulfillment. This was more than just an article. It was a call to action, a reminder that change was possible, but it required effort, awareness, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. A few weeks later, the story was published, garnering widespread attention. The response was overwhelming. Messages of support, outrage at the injustice, and calls for reform flooded in from all corners. The article served as a catalyst for conversations about race, bias, and the need for systemic change. Meanwhile, Carter took David's words to heart. He enrolled in sensitivity training, actively sought out diverse perspectives, and made a conscious effort to approach his duties with empathy and fairness. His colleagues noticed the change, and slowly, his actions began to reflect the lessons he had learned. One day, as Carter patrolled the same streets where the incident had occurred, he spotted David in the crowd. This time, their meeting was different. Carter approached with a nod of respect, and David greeted him with a small smile. "How's it going?" Carter asked, genuinely curious. David shrugged. "Busy as ever, but making progress." Carter nodded. "I read your article. It was eye-opening. Thank you for sharing your story." David appreciated the sentiment. "It's important that people hear it. Change starts with awareness." Carter agreed. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since that night, trying to do better." "That's all anyone can ask for," David replied. "Keep at it." They stood there for a moment, two men from different worlds, brought together by an unexpected and transformative experience. There was a newfound understanding between them, a mutual respect that had been hard-earned. As David walked away, Carter felt a sense of hope. He knew the journey toward true equality was long, but he was determined to be part of the solution. And as David disappeared into the crowd, Carter made a silent vow to continue his personal journey toward growth and understanding. The story didn't end with a perfect resolution, but with a promise of progress, a reminder that change was possible when people were willing to confront their own flaws and work toward a better future. It was a story of hope, of redemption, and of the power of individuals to make a difference in the fight against racism.